Comrades, what an incredible time to be having a school like this, right? You know that originally this first opening session of this school was going to be entitled, "Where is America Going?" And in the last week, looking at the events around the world, we were like, we need to switch gears a little bit. It's important that we put this in front of the entire party, this mass movement of millions of workers moving as workers in Europe in a general strike, a political general strike against Gaza, against the genocide in Gaza. It's Israel's genocide. This, the perspective we've had for this struggle has long been something that's, abstract for people. It's hard to understand what we mean by class politics when you haven't seen a concrete example in a long time. I remember having a discussion this summer with some relatives where sort of a debate breaks out around the dinner table. And there was a divide, a generational divide between the older members at the table and the younger ones. And we're discussing Israel's genocide and whether UN declarations are actually helping or not. And the point was made. The younger people were making the point. The UN says whatever it wants, and Israel acts with impunity. The United States ignores and vetoes every resolution denouncing this. It makes no difference. It actually gives the impression of making a difference, and it's not. And at one point in the conversation, the question was posed, okay, what do you propose? What is the alternative? And this is the part where we're explaining the working class has the power to move. The working class has the power to stop the shipments, to paralyze society, to rise up. And at a certain point, it was kind of like, it was just becoming abstract for people. They were saying, well, are you saying that in the 2020s, you're going to have, a political general strike, and the workers are going to rise up, and they're going to paralyze the shipments, and this is going to happen in several countries? Is that what you're proposing? And at the time, we were thinking, when's the last time something like this happened? Okay, well, in the Russian Civil War in 1919, the longshore workers in Seattle and in San Francisco, they blocked the shipments that are going to go provide arms for the counter-revolution in Russia. Okay, something like that might happen in 1919, but this is the 2020s. Comrades, that is exactly what the European working class has just done. In the last week, the world has seen class politics come back to life. This is international class solidarity, a mass political general strike against imperialism. When is the last time we saw anything like this? Certainly, it's been generations. And it's worth taking a moment to consider the scale of these remarkable events. You had 2 million people last Friday across 100 cities in Italy. Every major city and even small cities had massive demonstrations, and it's not just protests and marches. You have hundreds of thousands of people in the street, but it's the working class moving and seizing control of the means of production, essentially. They're talking about blocking every harbor in Italy, and the dock workers deciding what ships come, what ships get to dock, what ships don't. They're making the decisions. That is an element of workers' control. You had the largest demonstration in Rome in 50 years. The trade union leaders estimated that it was up to 1 million people just in Rome alone. 150,000 in Milan, 150,000 in Bologna and Florence each. Demonstrations that were stretching 2.5 miles long as the procession's coming down the street. You can't even see the end of it. 80,000 people in Naples. The largest demonstrations they're saying in a lot of these cities in 25, 30 years. They blocked the roads, all the major highways, railways, of course, the harbors, airlines, oil refineries. And you had participation in Italian industry, in the factories, of between 60 and 80%. So these streets are not just filled with random activists or students or demonstrators. All of the youth were out there as well. But you have metal workers and auto workers and teachers and firefighters and healthcare workers and airline workers organizing as workers. There's construction sites, and the construction workers are waving to the procession going by and giving fists of solidarity and joining the procession. You had one sign in the street that said, "We wanted to liberate Palestine, and now Palestine is liberating us." Because the Italian working class for a long time has felt this growing discontent and has not found an outlet for that discontent. And now the struggle of Palestine is becoming the focal point. It's becoming the lightning rod that gives an expression to all of this. They're learning also from the movement in France. We've had several national strikes in France in the last period, in the last month alone. Building on this movement, block everything, bloquons tout. And they've brought down the 5th prime minister that France has had in the last 2 years. Le Cornu, the last prime minister, he lasted for less than 14 hours. It was like 835 minutes. And luckily, Macron has appointed the 6th one yesterday. But a comrade pointed out, the French ruling class is literally out of ideas. They reappointed Le Cornu. So he's going to come back and give it another try and see if the French working class accepts it this time. They've been saying block everything, but how many times have we seen demonstrations that say shut it down? And people shout that into a megaphone, but what are they shutting down? And we've been pointing out, if you really want to shut it down, this is possible. But it's not going to happen by marching from point A to point B. And it's not going to happen just by shouting slogans in the streets. It needs to be a movement of the working class. And for a long time, people didn't understand what that could look like. Now they have a crystal clear image in front of them. This changes. This is the beginning of a new epoch of the class struggle in Italy, in Europe. This struggle is not going away. At the same time that the Italian working class was moving, you had 2 million people in Spain. 500,000 in Madrid alone, 300,000 in Barcelona. The Spanish working class is stirred by this. The youth are moving. 82% of the Spanish population recognizes Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide. This is the shift of public opinion dramatically on a global scale. Netherlands, in Amsterdam, that's a city within city limits, you have less than 1 million people. You had 250,000 demonstrating in Amsterdam. The drone footage, they call this the red line. If you look at the image, it brings a tear to your eye, it gives you goosebumps. 250,000 people all wearing red as well. A massive, massive demonstration. And it's not just in a couple of these cities. Hundreds of thousands more in Ireland, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, Bulgaria, Finland, Poland, Portugal, Switzerland, Romania, Greece, Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, Malaysia, Indonesia. I'm not talking about the last couple years or the last month. I'm talking about last Friday. A massive, massive demonstration in response. I mean, the tipping point was the IDF's attack on the global Sumud Gaza Solidarity Flotilla that was trying to break Israel's blockade and deliver humanitarian aid. I think you all know that the IDF seized the boats and arrested 450 activists from 44 countries. They brutalized these activists. They denied them food and water. Greta Thunberg and a lot of other public figures were on these, and the IDF soldiers they forced Greta Thunberg to kiss an Israeli flag, and they wrapped her up in it and marched her around to parade her. What force acts like this? A force that is used to acting with impunity. A force that's used to doing whatever it wants with no force out there to say, you can't cross this line. But the workers of the world are seeing this. The workers of the world are drawing the line now. World sentiment has turned against the Zionist state. Anti-imperialism is coming forward. This disgust at genocidal crimes. Israel has become isolated on the world stage, and US imperialism is increasingly isolated on the world stage. Marco Rubio said just a week ago, we cannot ignore the impact that this has had on Israel's global standing. Trump just last Saturday says, Bibi has gone too far in Gaza, and Israel has lost a lot of support in the world. Now I will return all that support. The point is, I can make a prediction right now. He's not going to return that support. Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement has been agreed to, but there's a lot of other phases here. Phase 1 has been the easy part. There's no guarantee that this is going to carry out. And certainly what it doesn't guarantee is that there's going to be any resolution or any stability in the region. The question of the oppression of the Palestinian people has not been resolved. But the Italian working class has showed the world that this is a working class issue. This is not just some faraway crime against humanity to be decried in humanitarian terms. This is part of a class war that is being waged against the workers of the world, because every Western government and many beyond are aiding and abetting Israel's crimes while they are attacking the workers at home. Suffering at home is allowing suffering abroad to take place. And the dock workers pointed this out. They said, we have the power. Actually, the Italian dock workers organized an international meeting of dock workers of the rest of Europe and said, we have it in our power to decide what docks, what gets shipped, what gets loaded, and what doesn't. And so they're making it a working class issue. This is a remarkable confirmation of the perspectives of this international, because they're showing that in practice, these are the methods that we've advocated. It shows that all along what was needed was a spark, some organized force to say, this is the way that we can mobilize. This is the power of the working class. Here's how we use it. And they gave the right call at the right time. And it wasn't just a random group of activists from the outside. It was organized workers. It was these dock workers saying, if they touch the flotilla, we're going to shut it down. And we're not just saying we're going to shut it down into a megaphone. We're going to paralyze the economy. And they begin with the docks. And they call on mass solidarity from the local population. And big demonstrations come up and back up the dock workers. And they do begin to shut it down. And that movement begins to spread. And initially, the CGIL, which is the National Federation of Trade Unions in Italy, it's like the AFL-CIO in the US. They have 5 million workers. It's a very conservative leadership. This is the establishment labor leaders. Initially, they opposed it. They had no intention of calling a general strike. But the movement from below forced them to. It forced them to get on board. The pressure that they were feeling from their own ranks forced their hand. And suddenly, this 5 million strong union confederation is calling for an official general strike, and that is the way that you mobilize the mass of the working class. It cannot be done by a small minority. It cannot be done from the outside. It needs to be done from the top. It needs to be done from the organizations of the working class, and this shows how this can happen. Now, of course, this hasn't happened in the US yet, but it can, and it will. That's the lesson of these events, is that before the Italian workers moved, you could have looked at that situation on the surface and say, why are people not moving? Why is there so much apathy? But the discontent was building below. It was waiting for an outlet. As soon as the outlet's provided, you see this explosion of a social wildfire. That is waiting to happen in the United States as well. Now, we have a very passive, conservative labor leadership in this country, an incredibly pathetic labor leadership that has overseen a decades-long decline. And the apparent ebb in the Palestine solidarity movement in this country is largely due to that, to the role of the labor leaders. But that dam of silence and inaction, that can be broken. Those floodgates can be broken. And then everything can be ignited. That's the lessons of this. And think about all of the motivation for a mass mobilization that the labor leaders could look to right now. I mean, they have this government shutdown that's been going on for a couple weeks now. 750,000 federal workers are receiving no paycheck. They still have to pay rent. They still have to pay their bills and feed their family. Trump is even saying that some of the furloughed workers are not going to receive their back pay. They're making use of this shutdown to lay off more workers. The Doge cuts have amounted to 300,000 job cuts since the beginning of the year. You know that in 1981, Ronald Reagan crushed the air traffic controllers. This was a famous defeat for the American labor movement, the PATCO strike. That was over 11,000 striking workers that were just dismissed summarily. And that was considered a tipping point for American labor, because the bosses looked at that and they said, these labor leaders aren't going to fight back. And they rolled over. They didn't step into the fight. And so they showed weakness in the face of aggression. And the ruling class says, okay, we can move forward. And they have. They've decimated the labor movement in the years since then. It reduced the union membership in this country from 23 million to around 15 million today. Now, that was the loss of 11,000 jobs. Now we're talking about 300,000 loss in the highly unionized public sector since the beginning of this year. This should be a sign for the American labor leaders to say, you know, at some point we better do something here. Right now what they're saying is call your representatives. Call the Republican Senate leaders and tell them to get back to work. They're not talking about striking. They're specifically warning their workers. We don't want any collective actions that could bring us into disrepute. Do not move. That is their main emphasis at this time. Well, remember the last government shutdown. At the end of 2018, stretching into January 2019, the president of the flight attendants union, Sarah Nelson, gave a speech, and she called for a general strike. And by uttering that phrase, she changed the situation, because the ruling class hasn't heard labor leaders speak like that for generations. And suddenly the workers hear that. You have huge sickouts of thousands of airline workers. Their flights begin to be canceled, and immediately Trump backtracks. That's exactly the way to solve this shutdown today. If they were to move and mobilize their forces, and there's no shortage of issues to warrant that kind of mobilization. Look at the shock and awe deployment of National Guard troops across the country. Everyone can see that this is political theater. I saw a Wall Street Journal article from last week that interviewed someone that was walking his dog, a worker, 54-year-old bus driver, in front of the ICE protests, where they're talking about mobilizing the National Guard. And he says, this is the quote from the worker. They asked him, what do you think about this mobilization of National Guard? He says, I think it's a desperate attempt to distract from the Epstein files, the bad economic data that's coming out, and the fact that the tariffs are failing. This is a perfect explanation from a worker of why Trump is trying to look tough at a time when he's actually weak. It's not the beginning of dictatorship. It's a distraction. It's not fascism. It's a farce. He is not getting stronger. Trump is getting weaker, and Trump's base is abandoning him. On every single issue, his policies are backfiring. He's getting negative approval ratings on, there have been polls of this. In handling of crime, he's underwater by 7 points. After all the shock and awe of the ICE raids, his handling of immigration is underwater by 8 points. After all this promise of the golden age of economic prosperity, his rating for jobs in the economy has been negative 22 points. And probably the most important factor is inflation. That's probably the thing that tipped him over in 2024 in the victory against Biden. That's received the lowest approval rating of any issue, negative 34 points. So he sends in the troops to distract and to intimidate, and yet the locals in DC, they call them the National Gardeners because they're deployed on beautification missions to pick up trash and to plant flowers. A major general, Randy Manor, said that this is very deflating for the soldiers. One of the guardsmen said, we're approaching critically low morale. It's falling fast. Now the Democrats, they're rubbing their hands together with every move that Trump makes because they're hoping that this is going to help them in the midterms, but they're playing the same game. They punt this issue to the courts and they say, Trump is breaking the Constitution. But do they have any intention of fighting for the American working class? Do the Democrats say that the Republicans are going to cut healthcare? Do they have any intention of passing any kind of policy that's actually going to give access to healthcare for the 100 million Americans who can't afford it right now? They have no intention of changing anything. They're playing the same game. But what we're saying with class politics is there is another force. You have two parties of the ruling class, and then you have a much more powerful force that isn't finding a political expression, a third force, the decisive force, the working class. Just imagine if the labor leaders were to have a press conference and say, Trump is using the National Guard deployments to distract from the collapsing economic conditions, from his attacks on the working class, from these mass layoffs, from his attacks on the healthcare system. This is an attack on the working class. This is a working class issue, and we're going to mobilize the forces of organized labor across the country. We still have 15 million union members across the US. At this time when organized labor is facing an existential crisis, where are the calls for mass demonstrations, for strike action, for rallies, for workplace meetings? The unions have 70% approval and have had historically high approval ratings for the last 5 years. This would be the perfect time to mobilize those forces. Imagine the massive support that they would unleash across the country if they came out swinging and said, we're going to fight back now. You have a crisis of leadership. There is a desperate vacuum of leadership. The working class is more powerful and actually more angry than ever before. That discontent has been building for decades. You have this universal rejection of the status quo, and it's looking for an outlet. And so far, the left has been completely ineffective at tapping into this. And this is the reason that you've had the rise of right populists. Right-wing demagogy has been the only organized force that's been tapping into this discontent and saying, you're right, your life is getting harder. Society's on the wrong track. We're going to turn around. And they channel it into reactionary anti-immigrant sentiment and say that is the problem. That is the reason that your life is getting worse. They're using it to confuse and to divide. But so much of the anger that's fueling right populism, it's economic class discontent, pure and simple. This is not a mass movement of racists or fascist reaction. This is the rejection of a dominant status quo that has led to declining standards of living for decades, for economic stagnation. Most Trump voters don't want a culture war. They're not clamoring for ICE raids. They want better jobs, better working conditions. And that's why we don't fear MAGA. We don't fear right populism. We don't accept the culture war framing of it that says MAGA is the enemy. We don't accept the liberal alarmist attitude that says this is the beginning of a dictatorship. We explain we live under bourgeois democracy. This is a dictatorship of the rich already. The ruling class is the enemy. The capitalists, the bankers, the billionaires are the enemy. Their political parties, their institutions, their media are the enemy. And this is another element that separates us, the Revolutionary Communist International, from the prevalent outlook on the left, which treats this global phenomenon of right populism as a rightward shift in society. We've explained, look where this right populist phenomenon is going internationally. Look at its, you can see the rise of it, but where is it headed? These forces are going to get into power in country after country, and they're going to preside over a collapsing system. Italy shows where things are going to look a few steps down the road. If anything, Meloni's government is a more direct descendant of the Italian fascist movement. Fratelli d'Italia was a fascist party. She came into power with 16% support from the electorate. And now she's overseeing a government that's hated, an economy that is completely stagnant. There's no investment in industry. People are losing their jobs, and the government is forced to implement austerity while billions are spent on rearmament, and you have a massive movement of the working class. This is the direction that this entire process is headed. You have the same process of decline throughout the West. And this mass movement of last weekend shows the real mood of the working class and of the youth that are looking for an outlet. Comrades might remember that a few months ago we published an issue of The Communist that had the headline, "American Youth Want a Revolution." And this was based on an international Gallup poll of the countries that have the highest levels of youth discontent. At the top of the list were Greek youth. 87% of young people in Greece say they have no confidence in the national government or the ruling institutions. Next in line was Italian youth. 68% said the same thing. And in third place, higher than any other country on earth, is US youth. 66.1%. They have no confidence in this government. The US working class, the US youth, US public opinion, it's not lagging behind. It's just faced with a crisis of leadership that's not giving an expression. It's not showing how to mobilize, how to capture this anger, what to do about it. That is the thing that is holding it back. And if you look at what's happened in Italy now, we're celebrating this massive display of working class power, but that's not the end goal. I mean, what is needed right now in Italy is a massive force that says, okay, block everything, but what now? How do we bring down the Meloni government? How do we bring down these imperialist governments throughout Europe? What is the next step to this? We need a massive force with a presence in those workplaces that have been mobilizing that can explain a working class program, how to channel this discontent into an actual revolutionary uprising. You need a cadre organization. And having a mass movement like this doesn't immediately solve the problems for our Italian comrades. They've sold 5,000 papers in those demonstrations last Friday. Those kinds of events are coming for the US, and that kind of public audience, that kind of demand for perspectives is already present. We see it everywhere we go. But we need cadres that can explain what is happening, what is the nature of this revolutionary epoch, what do we mean by this crisis of capitalism. Lenin's entire strategy, the forging of the Bolshevik Party, was based on explaining that this is not just an organizational task of gathering people together. It's not just the numbers. It is an ideological task of clarifying in the minds of those cadres the philosophy, the philosophical foundation of a Marxist worldview. We need to be able to see what's happening on the world stage, understand the process unfolding beneath the surface. The dominant view on the left is one of pragmatism. It's a very surface level impressionism. It looks at what it's faced with and it fixates on the surface. It's not looking at where the process is headed. We're saying, comrades, that the events in Italy, the events in Europe, and the events in Nepal, in Bangladesh, these massive revolutionary insurrections, that is what's coming for every capitalist regime on the face of this planet because of the crisis of the system. You know, that we've looked at polls that show this anger of people that say they want to tear down the system. What you've seen in these Gen Z revolutions is that sentiment is actually leading to tearing down the system in practical terms. In Indonesia, this this revolution that we've seen in the last couple months, 37 regional parliament buildings were stormed and burnt down or partially damaged by demonstrators. You had mass protests breaking into the homes of members of parliament, raiding their luxury items and live streaming it. They burnt down not one police station, not 50, but hundreds of police stations across Indonesia. The police have also been scattered. In each of these situations, the state has had no power to control the mass movement. Last summer in Bangladesh, this is a country that has 600 police stations. 450 of them were burnt to the ground last summer. That's a big proportion. The Nepalese masses burnt their parliament building to the ground. And a lot of these movements, the important thing isn't that they're torching the institutional buildings. The important thing is they've reached the threshold of power in each of these instances. The state has been suspended in midair. The police scatter, they flee. The members of parliament are fleeing the country. The heads of state are being helicoptered out of their country. Power is in the hands of the working class, and what is missing is a force that can say, here's what we do next. That's the missing ingredient. It's a very simple, the missing ingredient is a Bolshevik force that can say, the power has already been taken by the working class. There is no other power to contend for it. Now we need to form a revolutionary government. Here is the revolutionary program. This is the next step. That is the missing factor in each of these situations. That threshold of power will be faced by every ruling class. They have no way to prevent it. They're trying to postpone it, but it's coming for them. And the reason we can say that confidently is because the crisis of capitalism is afflicting the very core of this system. Marxists have a perspective that no one else in the political landscape has about what is happening with this decline in society. Everyone can sense the decline. You don't need to be a Marxist to point out society is on the wrong track. Everyone can feel that. But you need to be a Marxist in order to explain what is the mechanism behind this. At the root, why exactly is capitalism in decline? And what does this mean? And for this, we do need a materialist view of history. Marx and Engels explained that there is a thread, there's a logical, continual thread of progress in human history. And that thread is the development of the productive forces. That is what determines if a mode of production can continue to survive, if it can move forward, if it has any life, any vitality, any youth left in it, if it is developing the productive forces. And if it stops developing the productive forces, and we're talking about improvements in productive technique, technology, making it more productive, more efficient to produce the basic needs of humanity. If that is moving forward, then on the whole, a ruling class will be justified to rule for an extended period. That is no longer happening. And world capitalism had represented a massive leap forward of the productive forces at an earlier stage. The main thing that was driving that was the growth of the world market. And we need to understand, we're talking about a pie, right? If the pie is large, you can share it with a lot of people. If it continues to grow, then you can have stability for a prolonged period. The pie of capitalism, the world market, was growing continually for a long period, the growth of the world market. And that came to an end with the end of the post-war boom 50 years ago. It was then given one more gasp. It was given one more space of breathing room, and that was the catastrophic collapse of the Soviet Union, the restoration of capitalism in China, the liberalization of India along with it. You brought a couple billion people into the market. That's a couple billion more into the workforce, into the consumer market. That gave capitalism its final gasp. It grew, finally, at a time when that growth rate had been disappearing. Comrades, that's it. There is no mass population waiting in reserve to be incorporated into the world market, and the world market is not growing anymore. Those growth rates are not coming back. That is something that tells you about the lifespan of the capitalist system. It has reached its peak. It's never going back to its youth. It is in its period of senile decay. During the post-war boom, the growth rates that you saw were around 6% a year for the world economy. Now, the US accounted for half of that. That's the basis of the American dream. If the world economy was growing at 6% and the US accounts for half of global GDP, that tells you there is room for growth and for stability. We have a totally different picture today. From 2008 to 2020, the world economy grew by just 2.4%. And even that has been slowing down. The World Trade Organization predicted at the beginning of this year a contraction of world trade for the first time in a long time of 0.2%. They've since revised that to say it's going to be less than 1%. It's coming to a screeching halt. And the larger share of that trade is sidestepping the US. With Trump's erratic tariff policy, other trading partners don't want to go into the US market. They're trading in other markets. So the US share of the economy is continuing to fall. It's down from half of world GDP to just 22%. We're going to see that trend continue to fall. The growth rates for the US economy used to be 6, 7, 8% during the post-war boom. Now, since between 2008 and 2020, average GDP growth was less than 1.3%. This is the sickness of capitalism. At its root, we're talking about something that used to be healthy, that used to be moving forward, that is no longer moving forward. Now, when we mean the productive forces, we're looking at a tendency that capitalism had to invest a section of what it extracted from the working class back into production, back into capital, right? Capitalist investment was the sign, because of this competition in the market, trying to improve productive technique. The tendency of the capitalists to plow a section of those profits back into production was the thing that actually led to an increase in the productive forces. That has come to a screeching halt as well. Forbes reported last year that the amount corporations spent on capital expenditure in relation to their profits hit the lowest level since records began in 1952. Around 60% of profits are going straight to shareholder payouts. That's much higher than during the post-war years. And corporations are now just stockpiling cash at record levels. The amount of cash that's just sitting idle in bank accounts, not being invested, not doing anything, reached $7.9 trillion last year. I found an academic paper that was doing kind of a deep dive into it. I probably spent too much time looking at it myself. It was published in the Journal of Empirical Finance in 2022. And you can look it up if you want. It's called Why Do US Firms Invest Less Over Time? But they took a study. This is a massive study of 15,000 public companies in the US. And they analyzed the total revenues that they have, the money at their disposal, and how much of it they're investing back into capital expenditure. Here's on average, since 1980, the amount companies spend on capital has declined by nearly 80%. This is across every single industry. In 1980, the average business was investing 12% of its money on capital. By 2020, this fell from 12% to 2.6%. The study points out IBM, this computer tech and IT corporation. It says the decrease in IBM's capital expenditure is phenomenal. In 1980, it was investing 27% of its assets back into production. In 2020, it was down to 1.7%. So the capitalists had a social contract with society. They're the ruling class. They own everything. They extract the wealth that's being produced by the working class. And their role is to plow back into production, to improve the material basis of humanity's ability to meet its needs. That contract has been broken now for 50 years. That's been replaced by a situation of just leeching from the economy. They're extracting, but it's not going anywhere. And as a result, what does this mean for jobs? We're not just talking about some abstract problem in the depths of the economy. Manufacturing jobs in the US have been declining for 40 years. The jobs that were lost during 2008, 9 million jobs during that crisis alone, many of those have never returned. When we say that the economy never recovered from 2008, this is what we mean. Last year alone, 87,000 manufacturing jobs were destroyed. 33,000 more manufacturing jobs have been destroyed since the beginning of this year under Trump, after his big promise to reindustrialize the country. You've also have the destruction since the beginning of this year of 7,000 construction jobs, 17,000 jobs, white-collar jobs in professional and business services. The business press is talking about the end of the white-collar era, an AI jobs apocalypse. We should look carefully at this question, comrades, and what it means for the years ahead. This is going to become a decisive concern for the American working class and for the working class around the world. The business press, they said, the CEO of Ford, Jim Farley, artificial intelligence is going to replace literally half of all white-collar workers. The CEO of Anthropic, an AI company, says AI could lead to the loss of half of all entry-level white-collar jobs, spiking unemployment to 20% within the next 5 years. If that were to play out, we're talking about Great Depression levels of unemployment. The CEO of Walmart, just last week, says it's very clear that AI is going to change literally every job. Maybe there's a job in the world that AI won't change, but I haven't thought of it. He says white-collar jobs are going to be the first to be affected. The company is implementing a 3-year hiring freeze. This is the largest employer in the private sector. They have 2.1 million employees. They've cut 70,000 jobs since 2020. In the last 3 years, Amazon has cut 27,000 jobs. United Healthcare, it's a very popular company these days, right? They're planning to cut 30,000 jobs. They're saying by the end of this year, they're going to have half of their calls taken by AI. So now people can have their insurance claims denied by a robot. I'm sure that's going to improve their popularity. JP Morgan is planning to cut 10% of its operations workforce. The World Economic Forum reports that 40% of corporations are already planning to use AI to downsize their workforce. This is what is coming for the entire economy. Bernie Sanders came out this week with a report that says 100 million US jobs could be eliminated by AI in the coming years. This is, after young people were told for years to go get a job in coding, and you have a social reserve, like this is your last chance at an American dream. You get the right job, you're gonna go into debt, but it's gonna be okay because there's gonna be a great job waiting for you at the end. You have 45 million people with student debt. 5.3 million of them are in default. Another 10% are seriously delinquent, 90 days behind. For the first time in history, college grads have a higher unemployment rate than the general population. There's 14 million people who are either unemployed or who need a full-time job and are stuck working a part-time job, according to the official government figures, the U6 unemployment. Outside of the pandemic, when the economy basically shut down, the jobs that have been created so far of 2025 are lower than any year since 2009. After Trump said this is going to be a golden age for the US, he's ushered in a period that can only be compared to the Great Recession. And this is before the economy has actually entered a formal recession. The economy is actually propped up completely by AI spending, by tech spending. There's been a lot of headlines about this in the last few weeks. Sam Altman of OpenAI has openly said this is a bubble. There's incredible hype around this. This is not going to last. And almost half of GDP growth this year has been spent on AI data centers alone. Between 40 and 50%, not on like big tech spending, data centers, just the buildings, the warehouses to hold these racks of servers. One Harvard economist said that in the first half of this year, investment in information processing equipment and software accounted for 92% of GDP growth. I'm going to say that again. 92% of GDP growth in the United States this year has been investment in information processing equipment and software. If you remove tech spending from the economy, the US economy would have had an annualized growth rate of 0.1%. Tech companies they're on track to spend $400 billion this year on AI. They're projected to spend $500 billion more in 2026. One article about this said that's more money than any group of firms has ever put to any use. There has never been this kind of concentration of capital deployed for any kind of project. After the destruction of World War II, you know that the US propped up Europe. It had to rebuild Europe. It spent it on the Marshall Aid for years into the 50s. The US, just to put this into perspective, the US has spent more money on the Ukraine war in the last 3.5 years on a failed Ukraine war. They've spent more money than they spent on the entire Marshall Aid, right, to rebuild Europe. Tech companies are spending in 1 year more than that on the AI build-out. The Apollo mission that put a man on the moon in the 1970s, over the course of a decade, spent $300 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars to fund and develop that entire program. AI spending, the tech companies are spending the equivalent of an Apollo program, not every 10 years, every 10 months is what they're spending. An MIT report from earlier this year said 95% of the businesses that are investing in developing AI are not making any profit. They're not turning any profit. It is a massive speculative bubble. The Financial Times earlier this week says America is now one big bet on AI. It accounts for 80% of stock market gains. And lucky for the 10% wealthiest Americans that own 85% of stocks, because that's going right into their portfolios, that's flooding them with cash. So 50% of consumer spending in the US is done by that 10%, who's doing quite fine. But it doesn't change the outlook for the rest of the economy. The economist said, if you pull AI out, the economy is basically in a recession. Real consumption has flatlined since last year. Housing is in a slump. There's practically no investment in any other industry. You've had several corrections to the official jobs reports over the last year. And if you put them together, what it means is that 1.2 million fewer jobs have actually been created over the last year than what was officially reported. All of this, and they're still saying, formally, they're not declaring a recession yet. Now, we've been talking to people across the country by the thousands. The RCA just had one of its most successful fall offensive in history. We've talked to 2,500 people have signed up to show their interest in joining the party we're having. But most importantly, these are discussions with young people on the campuses about capitalism. And the reports coming in, the attitude of these young people is showing a direct concern for their own futures. It's not just a vague attitude of rejecting capitalism. They're looking at what's going to happen for me when I enter the labor market. In fact, most of the people that are interacting with us are already workers. We're talking about working class students that are working and going to school, taking on debt, and saying, what's going to happen? The campus isn't just a bubble that separates you from the real economy. They're saying it's not looking good when people get into the labor market. They're worried about what it's going to mean for them, and they're right to be worried. That mood that's translating into a rejection of capitalism because of direct concerns over what it means for their lives, that has revolutionary potential. And that mood, that revolutionary mood, is going to continue growing because it's a symptom of the decline of society, an unstoppable process. If you look at this 80-year period of stability after the end of World War II, that is coming to an end. When we talk about the liberal world order, it hinged around US economic might, US military might. All of these international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, and the UN, the linchpin of all of that was the power of US finance, the US economy. That power has come to an end. And this 50-year period of decline that we've seen by every single measure since the 70s is finally catching up to reality. That is finally finding an expression in people's consciousness. Mass consciousness is finally catching up with 50 years. During the boom, if you adjust for inflation, during the post-war boom, the median income of a 25-year-old with a high school diploma was making $10,000 more than what a 25-year-old is making on average in the US today. Not only that, they were getting ready to buy a house on average. The average home buyer was in their 20s. Again, inflation-adjusted dollars, the median home value was $47,000. Young people aren't talking about buying homes today. They have no prospects for this. But the point is that over the last 50 years, the ruling class has squeezed this out of the hands of the working class. That has been taken from the proletariat into the pockets of the bourgeoisie. This is the class struggle over 50 years that's led to this. Meanwhile, the housing crisis has led to a spike in homelessness. We have the highest homelessness level in the US since World War II. Last year, at some point over the year, 1.5 million people had to sleep on the streets or in a shelter. At the height of the Great Depression, that reached 2 million. We're not that far off, comrades, from that level of misery. And behind all of these statistics, you have this growing level of despair, of anxiety, of depression. The suicide rate in the US has increased for the last 2 decades, and it just reached its highest level since 1941. Household debts have also reached a milestone, the highest of all time, $18.2 trillion, affecting 8 out of 10 households. This debt, this is another measure of the decline, the depth of the decline. If you look at the growth rates are gone, investments drying up, so the system is artificially propped up by a growing diet of debt. In the early 1970s, the US debt, the total debt market was $1.5 trillion, right? By 2008, it surpassed $50 trillion. Since then, it's more than doubled, $104 trillion in the total debt market. 38 trillion of that is public debt. The government's spending 1.1 trillion just on interest, which is more than it's spending on the military. And this is the reason that Trump can't ignore the national debt anymore. His hand is forced to austerity, just like every ruling class on the face of this planet. They are going to be forced to make cuts. And that spells the kinds of events that you've seen, the mass discontent, the uprisings in France. The fall of all these governments is because of this battle over austerity. You may have heard of zombie corporations. This is a term for businesses that are not only in debt, but they're not generating enough revenue to pay the interest on their debt. What does that mean? It means that the company can only survive if it continues to take on a growing amount of debt just to cover the interest payments. Not a good situation for a business to be in, right? 40% of publicly traded companies in the US are zombies. This American capitalism is living on artificial, it's being propped up. It's weakened by every single measure. They're not competitive. The capitalists are not investing. They have no incentive to invest. They're just pocketing, like leeches, they're pocketing the surplus value that's being produced by the economy. And you have a similar situation in all of the advanced capitalist countries, in the rest of the OECD economies. I think it's worth pointing out that China is one country where you do have massive levels of investment, largely thanks to a heavy-handed state industrial policy. In World War II, the United States, the government was buying machinery. The government was spending on capital to build up that productive capacity. Basically, the Chinese government has been doing that same thing. They restored capitalism, but it's state capitalism, essentially. And so for the last 15 years, 42% of China's GDP has been spent on machinery, on factories, on equipment, investment in research and development for advanced manufacturing, more than double what's being spent in the US and basically in the rest of the world market. All of these cutting-edge technologies and the markets that they're competing over, AI, chips, the data centers, rare earths, renewable energy, the high-tech arms, it all requires a massive scale of investment, more investment than what private capital is willing to put into production. And so the state is stepping in. And this is the reason that Trump is trying to move to take a share of, a controlling share of stakes in a lot of different industries, in US steel, in rare earths mining, in Intel. It's a sign of weakness of a system of industry that needs to be propped up. But the problem is, even for China, they've built up this massive capacity, but they've exceeded global demand. China has built up, you have this term in economics, capacity utilization. You have this ability to produce to meet a certain demand for a commodity. The utilization of Chinese industry peaked in 2017. It's been declining across every industry since. And because China's running up against the narrow limits of the world market, they're forced to dump their commodities cheaply onto other markets. Now that they have this trade war with the US, they're pouring it more and more into Asia, Latin America, Africa. This is Chinese imperialism basically trying to outmaneuver US imperialism. And this rivalry is the basic fact of our time for the world market. But it's causing havoc and destroying industries in a lot of the world. Look at Indonesia, where you just had this massive revolution. Chinese exports surged 50% in the last year alone in Indonesia. Since 2023, 300,000 textile jobs have been destroyed in Indonesia. So it's fueling an economic crisis, levels of despair and unemployment that are also turning to this political destabilization around the world. These are the limits of the world market. There is nowhere else to turn. There is nowhere else for this investment to go into except for this AI bubble. The IMF predicts that 150 million workers in India alone are in highly AI-exposed jobs. 150 million. And that's the fastest growing economy in the world, technically. Now that Chinese growth has dipped below 5%, used to be double digits growth in the 90s, it's been steadily declining. China is also slowing down. There is nowhere that's safe. There's nowhere that's bucking the trend. This is the decline of global capitalism. So I guess the tens of millions of people whose livelihoods are threatened in the coming years can take comfort in the new frontiers of really advanced chatbots and hyper-realistic AI slop videos. It's going to drum up a lot of business for the energy sector. By 2030, data centers are on track to consume the same amount of electricity as 2/3 of American households. That's 16% of the US grid. None of this is in the interest of humanity. None of this is in the interest of the working class. But this is where the market has taken humanity. This is when you have the profit motive in the driver's seat. Over the last decade, 1/3 of US GDP has been big tech industries. They're propping up, they talk about the Magnificent Seven, right? Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Tesla. They have a combined valuation of 21 trillion. This is the most amount of capital that has ever been concentrated in any industry for any purpose. And what does humanity have to show for it? Well, we have the world of smartphones. We have social media algorithms. We have this gift from capitalism that has led to the average person spending 7 hours a day staring at a screen. For Gen Z, the figure is 9 hours. On average, the modern student is going to spend 25 years of their waking lives scrolling on screens. And I think we can all sense that this is having some kind of impact. You know, you don't just make a change like that without having some impact on the way people operate, the way people think. There was a study by Columbia University that found that the average attention span is declining. I don't think this is controversial. I think we can all kind of sense it. They said they had a study from 2004, the average attention span, and this is connected to screen time. On a given task, the average attention span was 2 minutes in 2004. In the last 5 years, they clocked it at 47 seconds on average. An OECD report published said that literacy levels are declining or stagnating in most developed countries. Reading habits have plummeted by 40% in the US over the last 20 years. There was a poll that asks 18-year-olds, and has for many decades, whether they have difficulty thinking, concentrating, or learning new things. That poll had stable results. It was always a portion, but it was a stable portion for many decades into the 90s and 2000s. And then around the 2010s, it started to skyrocket, the number of people who say they have difficulty focusing, concentrating, learning new things. And whether social media, you know, I'm not making an argument against social media and phones in general. Like, this is obviously a very powerful tool that we could be using in a rational, in a planned way. But the way it's being used under capitalism is having a very damaging effect. Connected with the general decline of society, there was a Harvard study from 2 years ago that found that 58% of young adults find little or no purpose or meaning in their everyday lives. 58%. There's a study in this quote that says, I just go to work, I do my mundane job, go home, prepare for the next day, scroll on my phone, and repeat. Now, for all those people out there who say, you know, you're a communist, you think you can be a communist and have an iPhone in your pocket? What about all this great technology? You can say, this is the working class. This is the great technology that capitalism has provided, and we're still working our lives away, working until you drop with no future that's being provided. So yes, we have something to scroll on. We have a little machine to distract us in our pockets. It's not actually making anybody happier. It's not doing anything good for humanity. There was another participant who said, I would really like to have some sort of meaning from working towards a goal or cause that betters humanity as a whole. I see the world falling apart in no direction for humanity, and I'd like to do something about it. You know, 30 years ago, the capitalists said, this is the end of history. The communists lost, we won, things are going to be stable now, it's going to be a peaceful world. And this is where the end of history has led people. People feel like there is no future for them. But history is not over, comrades. How many times have we encountered this sentiment that says, the world is going down, I want to know what to do about it. I want to fight against this. I'm looking for someone to say, this is how you do it. This is the voice of an entire generation that's been born into this period of deep capitalist decline. Nobody chooses what period to be born into, what phase in the life cycle of a mode of production. But if you think about it, comrades, we're revolutionaries. We're lucky. We are lucky to have been born, to have come on the scene at this time when all historical forces are pushing millions in the direction of revolutionary conclusions. That's what this decline of capitalism means for us. And as Bolsheviks, there has never been a better time to be alive. Comrades, we're not the first to try this. The task of our international, of overthrowing a ruling class that has lost its historical justification, that has outlived its historical purpose, to try and usher in a truly human system, this has been tried by previous generations. But the conditions we are working in today are more favorable than have ever faced any revolutionary generation in history. They are more favorable today than ever before, comrades. We have to recognize that is what this new epoch means. In this world of pessimistic doom, of sense of decline, Marxist perspectives alone provide revolutionary optimism, not because we have a religious view, not because of mysticism or idealism or hopeful thinking. It's because of the materialist conception of history. We have optimism because we understand the process that is unfolding concretely beneath the events. We understand where this is going. Comrades, we see the human material for a mass revolutionary party. It's being forged by history right before our eyes. We encounter it every day. And we have within our ranks the determination and above all the ideas, the political clarity to gather this into a force that is going to transform human history, comrades. Let's carry it to conclusion.